and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. Today I have with me Mr. Aurodeep Nandi. He's the India economist for Nomura, which is a global financial firm. And today we are going to talk about something that's very relevant, very much in news: inflation, the rate at which prices are increasing. And this is not something that's terribly difficult to grasp for most readers. All of us understand and feel the pain when the prices are going up and inflation rate rises. But today we'll try to understand why is it that India has been facing high inflation for the better part of last 2 years. Roughly since November 2019, we've been seeing that retail inflation rate, which you and I face as consumers, has been going up and has stayed high. Typically, RBI expects the retail inflation to be between 2 to 6% and tries to target a 4% number. But retail inflation has been near or above 6% for the better part of the last 2 years. So we'll try to understand from Aurodeep what are the causes that are creating this, and what are the implications of this, and what are the ways in which we can possibly reduce the high prices that we are facing. So thanks, Aurodeep, for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And let me first ask you that, this is a fairly obvious question. I think a lot of readers have that, we've been hearing for the past, I think 3 years at least, that India's economy has a demand problem, that not enough is being demanded by consumers. That is the weak part of India's economy. And yet, we are also seeing that inflation has been on the higher side of the RBI's comfort zone. And those two things don't typically match on the face of it. So can you explain what's been happening here?
So that, one side of what drives inflation, as you said, is the demand side, which is there's a limited number of goods and services. There are more people demanding it, and hence the price of that rises. But the other side is the supply side, right? So if your telecom company decides to raise tariffs, if petrol, diesel prices rise, if the price of your LPG cylinder goes up, that also creates inflation, right? So you don't have to wait for the demand side to catch up. There are these supply side shocks that sort of come in. In the case of India, I think we've had sort of a series of unfortunate accidents on inflation, and I think what sort of happened is one domino has been very close to the next domino, and all of these dominoes have been falling in pretty rapid succession. As you mentioned, even before the pandemic, we started having inflationary pressures. We had telecom companies raise their tariffs. There were unseasonal rains at the end of the year, so vegetable prices go up. Vegetable prices, it's a very volatile component. It's very dependent on rains, and fortunately or unfortunately, it influences the headline inflation quite a lot because it's a huge quantum that goes up. So and typically it's vegetable prices that go up on headlines, right? Tomato itna ho gaya hai. But the point is that it impacts the broader basket of goods and services. Now, so headline inflation was elevated, and then the pandemic struck, right? Now, the first temptation that a lot of the economist community had was that, hey, look, the pandemic is this huge demand shock, right? It's going to come, it's going to destroy demand. And exactly the point that you were earlier alluding to, which is that if demand goes down so much, then there'll be an excess supply of goods and services, and hey, inflation should come down. In a testament to how wrong economists can get, the diametric opposite happened, right? What instead happened was that supply chains started getting hit, right? So once you had lockdowns, you had you had a lot of disruptions across supply chains, and as a result of which we also found demand for certain products rise up quite a lot. In some cases, there was kind of precautionary buying. Right, you would remember these drastic scenes at the start of the pandemic of people just flooding stores, trying to get as much as they could before lockdown started. Now, all of this, what it created was that it caused food prices, especially, to rise up. Now, along with food prices, we also had what is known as core inflation picking up. Now, what is core inflation? So you've got food, which is like vegetables, cereals, pulses, etc. Understandably, these are more impacted by rainfall, by the minimum support prices the government sets, by global prices, etc. So you take out food, and then you take out fuel, which is your LPG, kerosene, etc. And then what you're left with is what is known as core inflation, right? So that's your health, household goods and services, personal care, recreation. Interestingly, even petrol and diesel are part of India's core inflation basket. And in the first few months of the pandemic, the RBI, the government didn't have a way to collect the data. So they used these high food prices as a proxy for core, as a result of which core inflation statistically became a little elevated. But beyond that, what happened is that the more services got restricted, right, the more the prices around them started increasing. So, for instance, if you are at a point where there's a complete or there's a partial ban on public transport, at that time an auto fare might actually be higher than what it would be in normal situation, because that person is working in a different environment altogether. Similarly, commodity prices also eventually started picking up. So what we saw in the pandemic year, say of FY21, was a large part of the above 6% inflation was explained by food inflation and also core inflation. Now FY22, which is sort of the year that ends in a few days, we found that food inflation came off, right? But here's where it gets interesting. The core inflation remained very sticky, right? And a variety of factors have played into this.
Just as the US Fed Reserve did, our central bank, the RBI, also for a very long time kept looking at this as a transitory thing. We kept reading commentary coming from RBI, and it appeared as if this is just a passing phase, things will improve, and things just kept getting hardened. So tell me one thing, has the RBI been behind the curve? Has it been underestimating the inflation in India?
So pretty much yes, in my perspective, and it continues to do that. It's even the recent remarks that have come from Governor Das, that has come from Deputy Governor Patra, seems to suggest. So look, I mean, there is some merit in what the RBI and how other central banks had dealt with the pandemic to start off with, right? Which is one, look, I mean, hindsight is always clearer than foresight, right? So we can sit now and we can say, oh, look, those pressures never went off. But, if you're sitting in the central bank and you're wondering what to do about an economy where prices have suddenly flared up like this, you really want to wait and watch, right? But while you want to do that, you also don't want to create a situation which kind of, creates a chokehold on growth.
Give us also your view on what's the outlook on prices from here onwards. Right now, we are hearing all kinds of bad news about the Ukraine crisis increasing crude oil prices or natural gas prices or any kind of energy cost. We are also hearing news about all kinds of commodity prices. Nomura came out with a report last week, which talked about a whole set of prices that may be increased. Also, you pointed out that there might be a pass-through from the firm's side also, because their costs are increasing. So what's your outlook from here? If you could briefly tell us, how much do you expect prices to go up or inflation rate to be high?
So we think that the inflation scare is real. It's going to stay. So the RBI seems to be of the view that inflation will moderate, and that's not a view that we share. In fact, we believe inflation for the calendar year of 2022 will be around 6.3% from 5.1% in 2021. So you can imagine that we are probably out of consensus in this. And there's a number of reasons why that is the case. One, first, if we just take the Ukraine-Russia out, if you looked at the February numbers, right, the February inflation numbers, now they turned out to be 6.1%. So we had Jan, which is a slightly shade above 6%. RBI said that, look, don't worry, don't panic, this is going to be the peak. Then came along February, and February also showed 6.1%. And this February number is untouched by the Russia-Ukraine crisis, right? Petrol, diesel prices have been on freeze from December or November onwards. So even the petrol, diesel prices were not hiked in the February reading. Instead, what we saw was sort of a continuation of these same very entrenched trends that we are really scared of, that are sort of coming through, which is we've seen, higher prices of white goods, so of electrical items, utensils, goods and services. Firms are passing on more and more cost to consumers, and that's sort of leading to pretty strong momentum in terms of core inflation. So, I mean, looking forward, we are going to see an sort of enmeshing of two forces, right? The inherent inflationary forces that were there in the system, plus this Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, the biggest and the most obvious impact is going to be on at the petrol pumps, right? So one, petrol diesel prices have to correct for the 2-3 months that they were kept constant. And then, global crude oil prices have risen. In fact, if you consider the average crude oil price in March and you compare that to that of December, it's around 50% higher, right? So that's huge. Every 10% rise in crude oil prices impacts inflation by anywhere by 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points. So there is a direct impact. Petrol, diesel prices, in theory, and probably in practice also at times, is sort of, it's completely passed through, right? There's no subsidy. So they've been artificially kept lower. Now they've got to spring back. That increase could be pretty steep, right? It could be as high as around 20-24%. And it now remains to be seen if the government says that, okay, let me cut excise duties and reduce the burden, but then that means that you'll have a fiscal impact because you'll have to forego revenues which you would have got. The second side is that even gas prices have gone up. So your LPG cylinder is now going to cost much higher than it was so far. It's again been frozen, and now those prices are going to come up.
I think you guys had an estimate on that. I think some 25 rupees for petrol or 35 rupees for diesel.
And around 300 rupees for per cylinder in terms of LPG. So, I mean, so one is that you've got these pressures that will come. Second, you've got higher commodity prices generally now coming in, right? So you've got Ukraine, Russia. These are one of the world's major producers of fertilizers. Fertilizer costs have gone up sharply. So the cost of farm inputs have gone up. So this year, what we've been seeing is that the average farmer is actually having to spend quite a lot more on inputs, fodder, diesel, electricity, fertilizers. These costs have gone up. And that in turn, the way the government sets the minimum support prices is that they connect it to the cost of a version of the cost of inputs. So you've got minimum support prices that could be rising. Plus, when global prices are high, domestic prices also tend to rise. So if I'm a wheat farmer and I suddenly realize that, look, there is a global shortage of wheat, which earlier was being fulfilled by, say, Ukraine, now I can go and I can sell my wheat at higher prices. Now, when that happens, right, so the MSP also has to take that into account. So, you could have a very steep increase in minimum support prices.